is illuminate three aspects from a neurobiological perspective that I think are important for educational considerations. And I'm more talking to policymakers and maybe teachers. One notion is the critical periods in brain development, and this has consequences for very early interventions, and I will give examples. The second is, the market dependence on perception on priors, on a priori knowledge. And this, I think, has profound consequences for the education towards tolerance. And the third point is that our children in the future will evolve more and more in very complex systems that exhibit nonlinear dynamics. And such systems, they are not controllable. They are not predictable with respect to their future trajectories. And this has consequences for the education towards humility. Now, what do neurobiologists believe? First, they believe that all knowledge that we can have resides in the functional architecture of the brain. That means in the way in which neurons are connected to each other. There is no other degree of freedom in the brain but connectivity. It sets the programs and the rules according to which cognitive and executive functions are organized. Then we believe that all mental functions are the consequence and never the cause of neuronal processes. So it's a naturalistic view that we have to defend. And then we believe, and we have good reasons for it, that neuronal processes obey the known laws of nature. We don't have to postulate further ingredients in the moment. Nevertheless, our brains differ from those of our cave-dwelling ancestors, and I already alluded to this the other day, despite of very similar genetic outfit. And the reason is an extensive epigenetic modification during brain development. It is particularly pronounced in human beings. It's also the case in other animals because of the protracted development of human brains. We develop until age 25, roughly. And this development is characterized by the shaping of the functional architecture, so of the core of all knowledge and all programs, by environmental influences, by interaction with the environment. And what's particularly important is that all these modifications are irreversible beyond the end of maturation. Now, the mechanisms that subserve this epigenetic shaping of brain architectures consist of a control of the growth of connections. At the time of birth, all neurons are already there, but they are not connected to a large extent. And then there are exuberant connections formed between neurons, and about 40 to 50% of these formed connections, they are again destroyed. And the decision as to which of the connections remains and which goes is determined by activity, i.e. by experience, by interaction with the environment, by education. And this process of making and breaking continues until age 25. This is a simple example, very intuitive. The two eyes are connected to the same neurons in the brain. This is the reason why the world looks the same if one looks through it with the right or the left eye. This requires a very sophisticated arrangement of connections that can only be achieved by interacting with the environment. Normally, most neurons in the cerebral cortex respond to stimulation of both eyes. But if there is a developmental accident, like opacity of the lens for a couple of weeks during early development, which is very frequent in poor countries because of perinatal infections, or if there is a non-treated strabismus, these connections become disturbed, and the eye that conveys inappropriate information gets completely disconnected from its cortical, from its cerebral target structures. It remains irreversibly blind. And there's a window of opportunity, and if this one is missed, the developmental process is irreversibly jeopardized. The rule according to which these circuits form and are stabilized is a simple one. Neurons wire together if they fire together. Connections are identified as functionally appropriate, and then they are consolidated. If they have no functions, either because of deprivation or inappropriate input, they get destroyed, and they get destroyed irreversibly. And the same process is observed throughout the brain, also at the level of the myriads of connections between neurons in the cerebral cortex that are responsible for the storage of knowledge and for the programming of all cognitive and executive functions. And this is just some examples. One can trace those connections by injecting fluorescent dyes, of course in animal experiments only. And then one finds a mind-boggling selectivity of these connections. These dark patches, they delineate functional domains. And the red and the yellow patches correspond to the termination sites of connections. And you see there's a perfect register in the normally raised animal. If, however, interaction with the environment is impeded, you end up with a random connectivity pattern. There is no more selectivity there. So there is drastic anatomical changes as a function of altered experience, i.e. education. So it's a general adaptive strategy. These principles hold throughout the brain. Only the time course at which the windows of opportunity open and close, they differ. And the general rule is the higher the functions that get installed, and this includes also social functions, empathy, responsibility, identity of the self. The higher these functions, the later the window of opportunity. And as I told you, these windows close at around age 20, and then they are finally completely closed at age 25. Now, the interesting question is, why does nature run the risk to let these fundamental properties of the network be interfered with by experience? Why not do everything with the genes, as simple animals do? The reason is that the epigenetic adjustment of the architecture is necessary in order to realize functions beyond the capacity of the genes. This is language functions, this is social functions, many, many things, functions that cannot be anticipated by the genes alone. And also, this epigenetic shaping is a prerequisite for cultural evolution because it allows to install in the architecture of the offspring experience that has been acquired by the parents. So it bypasses the genetic Darwinian process. It's much faster and is necessary for cultural evolution. So we are dealing with a fundamental process that is constitutive for mankind, constitutive for our culture, that depends entirely on education and is limited to critical windows of development, of opportunities that must not be missed. Now, another interesting aspect is that it is the brain that has the initiative to select the information it needs in order to self-organize properly. This epigenetic adaptation is an active, attention and motivation-dependent process. It is not passive imprinting. It follows exactly the same rules as adult learning. And the consequence for education strategies is, of course, you have to instruct, and human beings are the only species that can intentionally educate. Animals can't do this, they just imitate. And for this instruction process to work, motivation is crucial because the brain has internal evaluation systems that select the activity that they use in order to optimize their architecture as a function of a large number of parameters, among others, motivation and attention. There are systems deep in the brain that evaluate the circumstances under which this epigenetic shaping takes place. And they allow it to take place only if these conditions are fulfilled. And one of these conditions is attachment and motivation. Therefore, teachers are indispensable. There can be a lot of learning through digital machines and tablets, but the attachment to the instructor is essential for these processes to work. So the conclusion is from this, developmental learning can be jeopardized, of course, by lack of nutrition, because all these processes are energy demanding, they need proteins. If they are not available, none of these processes can work normally. But also deprivation, lack of stimuli, lack of opportunities is a very dangerous situation. Then the ambiguity of embedding environment. If the brain cannot make up its mind which signals are really interesting and important for the optimization of architectures, they are neglected and not used. And then, as I already mentioned, lack of motivation, very important. The second issue, the dependence of perception on priors. We know that perception is a constructivistic process. We use a huge amount of a priori knowledge in order to interpret the sparse sensory signals that we get from the environment, and then we make up our perceptions. And it is this knowledge that determines what we perceive and how we perceive. And I give you an example, which I think is quite impressive. I tell you that surface A and surface B have exactly the same brightness. It doesn't look as if, but you will see in a moment that this is really true. It's just changing the context. You see that they are exactly the same. Now, why do you perceive this so differently? Because your brain sees the shadow of this green column and then calculates, saying that if the same amount of photons comes from surface B than from surface A, which is the physical reality, then B must be much brighter because there's a shadow on it. What you perceive is the result of a very complex computational process, an inference process that is based on a priori knowledge, determines what you perceive, and you have to believe what you perceive. You cannot perceive it otherwise, even if you know why you perceive it that way. Now, what are the sources of this a priori knowledge that we use in order to perceive the world as it appears to us? And this question is reducible to the question, who shapes the architecture of the brain? Because this is where all the knowledge is stored. And there are three sources. I already talked about it. One is evolution. Through adaptation, brain architectures have adapted to the world and stored knowledge about the so-being of the world. This is implicit knowledge. We don't know that we have it. We use it all the time, but we haven't been around when it has been acquired. It was before us. Then there is this developmental epigenetic shaping process, which mostly also installs implicit knowledge that we are not aware of, because when it was acquired in early childhood, we don't remember, because of childhood amnesia. And then there is lifelong learning that also changes these priors, this a priori knowledge that determines our perceptions. Part of it is explicit, we know where we got it from, and then we can also put it we can question it, while the other knowledge we cannot question. It has the status of convictions. So, bottom line, the functional architecture of the brain depends on both genetic and epigenetic factors. And the distinction between the two is difficult, if at all possible. Both factors are very important, equally important, but it's very difficult to draw the borderline between them. Now, this has consequences for education towards tolerance. At least teachers should know about it. They should convey the notion that cognitive schemata determine what we perceive. You just saw what you perceive because of your inferences. And the same is true for every sort of perception. There is no perception without a priori knowledge possible. Then it's obvious that culturally acquired schemata, they are of course different, because if people are epigenetically shaped in different environments, they will end up with different architectures. So they will perceive the same social reality in quite different ways. But because this determinant is implicit, it will have the status of convictions. You cannot discuss about it. People perceive what they perceive, and this is their truth. So there is no right or wrong in this case. And this applies for all perceptions, especially for those of social realities. So what is needed is education for the reciprocity of respect. There is no point in trying to teach somebody that he's wrong if he perceives something differently from you. I think that is very consequential. And then let me briefly come to the third issue, the fact that we have created, by cultural evolution, extremely complex systems that exhibit nonlinear dynamics. And I think this has some consequences for the education towards humility. Let me explain. Examples of complex systems with nonlinear dynamics, some of them are found in nature, the weather, but most of them are due to biological evolution and then to cultural evolution. The brain is a prime example of such a complex system with nonlinear dynamics. Therefore, its future trajectories are not predictable. Large ecosystems have these properties. Economical and financial systems have them. People playing on stock market should know about it. It's not predictable, even though they say something different. And the same is true, of course, for political systems. And even simple systems like three coupled pendula, if you couple three pendula with rubber strings and have them evolve in time, you cannot predict their future trajectory. So leave alone the larger systems I was just mentioning. So such systems all have in common to consist of numerous active elements, we call them nodes, that are reciprocally coupled and form large interaction networks. And they exhibit nonlinear dynamics that resist deterministic control of future trajectories. It is in principle impossible, even if you know all initial conditions, to steer such systems by changing some of the parameters in a wanted way over a long period of time. They will evolve as they decide to evolve, they self-organize. So there's no way to dirigistically control them. And this is an important message. Here's just an example of the mind-boggling complexity of connections in the cerebral cortex. These are the connections that get modified by experience, for example. So every brain has a very different architecture, even though the genes are the same. Here's a nice picture. I just like it graphically. This is the sort of connectivity pattern you can get from a human brain if you use non-invasive imaging technology. And here's the connectivity graph in the human brain. It's of the same nature as the interaction graph of proteins in a living cell, or of interacting companies, or of trading connections in the world. It's always highly complex systems with nonlinear dynamics. Now, unfortunately, our cognitive abilities have been adapted to linear dynamics because only linear systems can be predicted. It would have been no point for evolution to endow us with the cognitive ability to predict the future of complex nonlinear systems because they are not predictable. So we have developed intuitions that are not adapted to our complex world in which we now evolve. They were well adapted to the life of an animal in a simple environment and little social interactions. Because of this adaptation, we have no intuition for nonlinear dynamics. We cannot imagine them. We make false predictions. We have the illusion of controllability of the systems in which we evolve. It's an illusion. We cannot. And therefore, because we have these illusions, we have confidence in dirigistic governance of these large, complex structures. Cannot be done. And for the same reason, we have confidence in hierarchical control structures. All these are false assumptions. They are not adapted to the world in which we live, in the moment into which our children have to evolve in the future. And this has consequences for education, I think. And I heard that in the Ross School, it's already done this morning, I heard about it. We have to expose our children to toy systems that exhibit nonlinear dynamics so that they get a feeling for it, because normally one doesn't really play with them. Then one has to foster confidence in the stability and resilience of these complex self-organizing systems that one cannot really control. After all, we live in such a world and we are still there. So these complex systems, they have self-healing properties. They are relatively robust if they are well organized. And then I think another consequence is that we have to learn to mistrust seemingly simple solutions. There are none. And then we have to learn to cope and to support the unpredictability of the world that we have generated. And I think the only way out is humility. To give up the idea that we can really control all those things, we have to be more confident in the self-organizing capabilities. But in order to have trust in self-organizing systems, they have to be organized in a particular way. They support only ethical behavior. And I have put at the end, bees, for example, who live in these hyperorganisms, they don't lie. They report how much food they have found where, because this is the only way to stabilize this system. So if we were able to extract principles of conduct that endow complex social systems with resilience and stability, we would be able to derive some of the criteria that we need to install through education. And some of these rules of conduct, I think, can be derived from studying complex self-organizing living systems that have been optimized by evolution for resilience, because they have only survived because they are stable, resilient, and self-healing. And we have some ideas of what makes it that brains are stable despite of the mind-boggling complexity, and why hyperorganisms are stable despite of these the multiple interactions in the nonlinear dynamics according to which they organize. And I think this is where I wanted to get it. The next slide should be blank. Yes, thank you very much.